My name's Jim Wades, and I happen to be president of the international president of the Morris Telegraph Club. And the Morris Telegraph Club was founded as an association of retired railroad and commercial telegraph operators. Years ago, when one joined, you had to submit a resume to prove that you were employed in the telegraph industry. Yeah, that was true probably until sometime in the around 1990 or whatever, and then we opened it up to those that were interested in the history of telegraphy and telecommunications. The majority of our membership is still primarily retired former telegraph operators, and of course, it's our emphasis is on the history of telegraphy, primarily the commercial telecommunications industry and the like. The fancy title of international president comes from the fact that we are structured based on the model of the ORT union, the Order of Railroad Telegraphers. So you had local chapters, and of course the international, much as you would in a labor union. So the rather officious sounding title of international president sounds like an affectation, but it's really a historical, reflexive historical title. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about the history of telegraphy. The title of the program is Canst Thou Send Lightnings? And so we're going to start the program here. Again, Canst Thou Send Lightnings comes from the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 35. And anytime telegraphers gathered for a meeting or a convention or the like, this would be the verse from the Bible that would always be referred to for the obvious reasons. And so this title reflects that. Many years ago, when we would have our annual Morris Day gatherings for the club, the business would be conducted in Morse code. Everybody would have a key and sounder, and it was a different role back then. So anyway, I'd like everybody here, hopefully, to take a moment or two to imagine a world before telegraphy. Throughout the entire course of human history, information could move no faster than a person or a conveyance, right? A person running, a person on horseback, message or mail basically being transported by ship. Certainly transportation, even in the early days of the rail industry, was inefficient and dangerous. There was no such thing as an international market, right? You didn't have, stock exchanges that were anything more than local curb exchanges and the like. Utility systems were impossible. You couldn't coordinate, for example, and manage a system of oil wells and pipelines and tank farms, large urban areas. Served by fire departments. There was no method to signal the fire department. There was no way to, for example, engage in distributed manufacturing in any kind of reasonable way. News traveled very slowly. Generally, again, no faster than it could be conveyed. But suddenly, this technology comes along that essentially annihilates time and space, right? We look back today on telegraphy as maybe being simple or primitive compared to the tools that we have. But in many respects, the telegraph was just far more revolutionary and far more impactful on the human experience than the internet or even cellular data networks. If you think about it, really, the telegraph lays the entire foundation for our modern interconnected world. First and foremost, it made efficient train dispatching possible, right? You could now convey train orders rapidly. Wayside telegraph operators could OS the position of trains, allowing them to be coordinated over vast distances, hundreds of miles, and so forth. News associations and press syndicates are formed. The Telegraph lays the foundation for the Associated Press, the United Press, the International News Service, press syndication. If Will Rogers wrote a column, he could walk into any telegraph office, be it in Oklahoma or Alaska, and he could file a story, and it would be with the Press Association in just a matter of minutes. Certainly, time was standardized by the telegraph. We take for granted standardized time, but you can't really standardize time without telegraphy. The telegraph certainly transforms stock and commodity exchanges into essentially international markets and international, let's call them engines of capital investment and so forth. The modern urban fire department becomes possible. Look at synoptic meteorology. Without telegraphy, you cannot create a surface map. Really, the telegraph had to be created before the concept of the synoptic meteorology could develop. Astronomy, how do you coordinate astronomical measurements without standardized time and that type of interaction? And certainly diplomacy and war are transformed, first with the Crimean War, and then, of course, during the United States Civil War. We really see the beginning of a long 150-year evolution of war, the politicization of war, you might say. The U.S. Civil War is the first war in which the political elements began to, let's say, dynamically interfere with the military expedients. Whereas a Roman general perhaps crossed the Rubicon, the die was cast, and the general was entirely responsible for how the war was prosecuted, and he either arrived as a hero or he was defeated. But during the Civil War, Lincoln begins to kind of meddle in the prosecution of the war. And this is a process that begins to evolve until by, the late 20th century, we have, well, let's face it, far more input from the executive branch and so forth in the day-to-day prosecution of war. So if you really think about it, the telegraph did pretty much everything the internet does. It's just that the internet is a great refinement, right? It's far more flexible, has tremendous amounts, greater circuit capacity. But the prototype, you might say, of the modern world really begins with the telegraph. So again, in retrospect, the telegraph seems like a simple concept, right? It's the electromagnetic telegraph. We don't go into this program about optical telegraphs and things of this nature that preceded the electromagnetic telegraph. But the electromagnetic telegraph, which was really the great revolution, in its simplest sense, that is a simplex telegraph circuit, simply consists of a power source, a series loop or circuit, and keys and sounders, right? It's a very simple type concept. In early telegraph practice, all that was available was the simplex telegraph loop. So if we look at this in a very simple concept, you have essentially the sounder. Okay, it's not a clacker, it's not a clicker, it's a sounder, and the sounder consists typically of electromagnets that pull down an armature, and they create the rhythm patterns, if you will, of Morse code. It's typically a series loop. Okay, so this is something that confuses hams sometimes Why is there a circuit closer, on a telegraph key? Contrary to popular belief, those do not exist to tune your transmitter. They were placed on telegraph keys to allow one to close the key so that he could receive, right? So when no communications was conducted on a simplex telegraph line, we had battery in series with the keys and sounders, okay, and of course, ground return, and this created a series telegraph loop. When one wanted to transmit, he would break that loop, and then that would allow him to control the relays and or sounders in the various telegraph offices on that circuit. So when no business was conducted, all the keys were kept closed, okay? And current was flowing through the loop. If one started to transmit, say here on the right, he would open the circuit closer. That would give him control of the circuit. He could go ahead and transmit his telegrams or his service messages, etc. And if this operator over here missed a word or the like, he could simply open up his key. And of course, the report from the local sounder here on the transmit side would cease. The operator would know that there was a fill required, that is a correction or an inquiry about message content. And that was called breaking the circuit. Thus, the term break that appears in both radio communications as well as, by the way, many computer keyboards, because in the early days of computing, when mainframes were the common computing method, if an error occurred with spooling a report from a program or the like, one would press the break key on the teleprinter to signal the mainframe that there was a problem. So to this day, when you see a break key on a computer keyboard, it is a direct descendant of this nice, 1840s telegraphic concept. A little piece of trivia. So again, if somebody wanted to transmit, he would open his key. This would break the loop, would give him control of the sounders and or relays in that telegraph, simplex telegraph loop. Now, it's important to understand that, there's a little more to even the basic simplex telegraph than this diagram, but it gets the concept here across in terms of the function of telegraphy. But of course, like all technologies, over time, there's obviously both progress as well as increasing complexity, as well as expanding infrastructure, right? So the telegraph relay is developed. Telegraph relays were used with local sounders, and the relay was a much lighter armature, had much greater flexibility in terms of adjustment, and it allowed operators to deal with things that were called soggy lines. For example, wet days when open wire pole line would get a little bit current loss and so forth on cross arms and poles, or foliage landing across the wires. A relay gave you the ability to manage some of that. Obviously, automatic repeaters, the Millikan repeater, the Ahern repeater, repeaters allowed telegraph circuits to be extended across country and to be automated, eliminating the need for, say, intermediary relay offices. Well-run operation like AT&T would have multiple repeaters composited across the country, and this would allow circuits to move, communications to move back and forth. Of course, the physical plant being the most expensive component in any telecommunications system, all of that copper and iron wire and the like, and so forth. There was an interest in making the most efficient use of that infrastructure. So first we find that the duplex telegraph is developed based on the bridge concept, right, and polar relays. This allowed two telegraph signals to be transmitted over a single wire. And then, of course, thanks to our friend Mr. Edison, the quadruplex telegraph is developed. This allowed 4 telegraph signals to go down a single circuit. In the 19 teens and 20s, multiplexing emerges with the development of effective vacuum tubes, primarily thanks to the research of and so forth, gentlemen like Edwin Armstrong and also Bell Labs. The stable vacuum tube oscillators and audio filter systems allowed for the development of frequency domain carrier systems where maybe 10, 15 telegraph signals can be converted to carrier that is essentially audio frequency shift keying or the like. And now you can have multiple telegraph circuits on a single wire. And eventually by the 1930s, there was single sideband suppressed carrier systems. So you had even greater number of channels, maybe 33 channels or more on a wire, and so forth. Composited circuits were eventually developed. For many years, I'm sure there's a few former telephone company guys here, but back before, say, the 1950s, and the development of microwave carrier, long-distance circuits were a very scarce commodity. They were essentially audio frequency pairs with vacuum tube repeaters, and very few circuits were available across country. It's easy to forget today that it was very rare to instantly get a long-distance voice connection on the public switch telephone network. You would typically contact an operator and they would arrange to get you a circuit across country, say to call from New York to San Francisco, and they would call you back maybe a half hour later, 45 minutes later, maybe an hour later, and say, I have a circuit for you, and then I will connect you, and then you had your communications. So AT&T, for example, the phone company, was a major user of telegraphy well into the 1950s and early 60s. The reason being is that you could essentially composite, or let's call it superimpose, a telegraph circuit on a long-distance voice pair. The telegraph circuit could be used for both internal company communications, technical issues like trouble tickets, and arranging attenuation at various points along at various central offices and the like, and furthermore, it also allowed some of those long distance circuits to be utilized for private wire services and businesses and things of this nature. So while you were having your conversation on the phone, you couldn't hear it, but telegraphy was being carried on the same audio pair, voice pair. This allowed the voice pairs to remain in revenue service, and because they were simply too scarce a commodity. By the 1930s, teleprinters become common. Technologies like varioplex and concentrators, which essentially used an automatic switching method to make maximum use of available circuit capacity by switching automated teleprinter operation to any available or the first available circuit, sort of like the old trunk hunting circuits, and PBX operation. And of course, automatic switching centers are established throughout the United States by companies, primarily Western Union, and to some extent Postal Telegraph, until it was absorbed into Western Union in 1943. And then, of course, we have wireless telegraphy, which I don't cover much here in this course or this presentation, because well, you're all hams. So you kind of know a little bit about the history of that. But an interesting fact about telegraphy is that because it was established so early on, the railroads began to adopt it extensively in the 1850s. And the wire services were created, not long after the Civil War. There were literally telegraph circuits everywhere. Matter of fact, one of Western Union's kind of 1920s, 1930s advertising slogans was Western Union everywhere. There were telegraph circuits in baseball stadiums and hockey arenas and opera halls and courthouses, and anywhere an important event might occur, there was a telegraph circuit. It was a massive, extensive infrastructure, really well into the 1970s, and as a result, the telegraph remained a very viable technology well into the post-war era. For example, the Chicago Board of Trade was still using manual Morse telegraphy in the 1970s. There's quite a few railroads that still had telegraph circuits in use into the 1980s. There were still people doing what was called marking the board, at the cotton exchanges and things of this nature, well into our lifetimes, the very recent era. This gentleman here is a wire chief. Wire chief was essentially the technical guy who was responsible for locating trouble in telegraph circuits. You can't really see it, but he probably had like a ZM3 impedance bridge somewhere there, and he would coordinate with linemen. He would patch around problematic circuits, and this process was called testing and regulating in the telegraph industry. But you might think of him sort of in this day and age as kind of a sysop or an IT guy. So this is an example of a wire chief at work. This is a photograph from 1920. This is the Bourse building in downtown Philly. The building's still there, but of course all this is gone. But these are duplex telegraph circuits, going through repeaters and so forth, and there were of course attendants, testing and regulating guys who were responsible for keeping these in operation. And you can imagine what the sound was like in a room like this with all the relays going and some local telegraph or mainline telegraph sounders and the like. So you can kind of get a glimpse of the extensive infrastructure that once existed in the telegraph industry. Of course, telegraphy originates with telegraph codes, right? Morse codes. And so it's important to know that in North America, the original Morse code is called the American Morse code. And this is the code that was developed by Morse and Vail. Primarily the latter, really, but the American Morse code is what you might call the mother tongue, and it's a somewhat different code than radio amateurs use, which is called the Continental code, or in this day more commonly International Morse. American Morse code is the original, and Continental code was developed a bit later in the 19th century at a convention in Berlin. Thus, it's called the Continental Code. And of course, it not only eliminated some of the unique spaced characters and variable dash length that was present in American Morse code, but it also added characters for things like umlauts and so forth to support international communications. So as a general rule, in North America, that is Canada, the United States, and Mexico, American Morse code was used for commercial telegraphy, and the international code was used for things like maritime services and of course amateur radio and the like, military communications. At various times in our history, particularly during the 19th and early 20th century, there was the Bain code for Bain's chemical telegraph. He developed his own code. And the chemical telegraph was essentially worked on a somewhat similar principle as the Morse system, except that it imprinted the electrical impulses on a chemically treated type of paper, and then the the Morse characters were much like a pen register. They were decoded manually. It really turned out not to be a popular system, and really not much more efficient than the Morse electromagnetic telegraph. And then for a time in the early 20th century, the Navy had its own wireless code. And the Navy, they have a better way of doing things. And so they developed their own Morse code, and it was short-lived. So essentially at various times in history, there have been up to 4 different Morse codes in use here in North America. The original American Morse code, again, was used primarily for commercial purposes. So this would be railroad telegraphy, wire services like Associated Press and United Press, pipeline companies like, say, Buckeye Pipeline and Standard Oil, any type of stock brokerage work, commodities exchange work, commercial telegraphy, that is things like telegrams and so forth, Western Union, Canadian National Telegraphs, et cetera, postal telegraph. And so that was the original Morse code. And American Morse also was widely used on the Great Lakes for wireless communications before the passage of the Radio Act of 1912. That having been said, you could still hear operators on the Great Lakes in the 1930s using the American Morse code on ship-to-shore frequencies, albeit unofficially. And in many respects, the American Morse code is a bit faster than the Continental code. And the reason for that is the nature of the differences in the two codes. Again, the biggest problem with American Morse code is when they laid the first undersea cables, they did not understand or have the technology for, let's call it, submerged repeaters, and they didn't understand fully the nature of capacitive and inductive reactance and the signal distortions that occurred. So in the early undersea cables, it was discovered very quickly that on-off, keying, basically turning a circuit on and off, didn't work. So what was developed and used really up until probably the post-war era was a polar keying. That is, a positive signal was a dash, and a negative signal was a dot, for example. And first, a mirror galvanometer was used to transcribe the code, and then later a sensitive version of that called the siphon recorder. And again, the process basically was oral or visual, I should say, translation of transcribed telegraphic impulses. But obviously, as you'll see in a moment, American Morse code could not be used with this type of polar keying, and it became necessary to eliminate these variable dash lengths and spaced characters that were in the original code. So here are some examples. For example, in our amateur world, C is dotted, but in American Morse code, J is dotted, and C is did. Okay, F, for example, in the Continental code is did, but in the American Morse code, it's did. Okay, if you look over here, R is did, Z is did, Y is did, and so forth. And the numbers are different. For example, one is did-dotted, 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 etc. Da is 5 in American Morse. So, what you would hear as an O, a railroad or commercial telegrapher would hear, as 5. 6 is 6 dots, did, and so forth. And so there's these spaced characters in the code. There's also 3 dash lengths. So T is da, just like in international code. L is a longer da, so it's da, and da. Okay, so although most operators substituted the letter O for zero, and O is dit, not did it, and not dit. It's dit. Okay, just like this is dit did it, not dit did it, but dit did it. Did it dit. Did it dit. Okay, and so it's a code that requires a sensitive sense of rhythm, and it's a code that is very syncopated, and so forth. And of course, as with all telegraphic communications, the telegraph operator tends to think faster than he can transmit, and therefore he seeks efficiency, right? So, for example, best regards in American Morse is da 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 dit da 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 dit, right? Love and kisses da 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 da, understood da 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 da, train order da 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 da, end of work da 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 da. Okay, long dash is a zero. A train order that requires a signature, did-da-da-dit, and so forth. Well, you may have noticed that did-da-da-da, okay, the pro sign, SK as hams call it, or sometimes VA, is actually imported directly from commercial telegraph practice, and really what you're transmitting is 3-0, okay, in American Morse code. Da-da-da-da-da, okay? And the same is true for FN. So if we go back a slide, F is da-da-dit, okay? And N is da-dit. So da-da-da-da-dit is da-da-dit-da-dit, or FN in American Morse code for finished. If you've ever listened to an NTS or RRI traffic net, CW traffic net, you will hear the pro sign da-da, separating the lines of the address or signature and a radiogram. Well, that's really the comma in American Morse code. So da-da, and there are some unique pro signs and so forth. Da, 4 dashes is a new paragraph, for example. You don't hear people saying da, like the double break there, or double dash, I should say, in international code. The advantage of the American Morse is that because of all these spaced characters, it's actually a faster code by about 10 to 15%, which in the course of a workday of, say, 12 hours for a telegraph operator, and also for the company, means greater revenue and more efficient use of available circuit capacity. So despite the creation of the Continental Code, American Morse retained its dominance in commercial telegraphy because, number one, there were already thousands of operators trained in American Morse code, but also because it offered the speed and efficiency over the international version. A common code that came into use in primarily press work at a later time in let's say, late 19th century, with revisions into the 20th century, was the Phillips code. This code was developed by Walter P. Phillips, a founder of United Press, and before that, an executive with Associated Press. And it's essentially a telegraphic shorthand. So you had basically 1, 2, and 3-letter abbreviations for very common words and phrases, and then of course a few longer ones for things like President of the United States. When you hear people say POTUS or SCOTUS in the media, these are reflexive responses to 125 years or so of press telegraphy. So for example, tomorrow afternoon, TWP, tomorrow morning, TWA. Yesterday evening, is YAP. Yesterday morning is YAM, and so on and so forth. And you can really convey information as faster than most people can type. It made for a very efficient way of transmitting information, which, by the way, brings me to the point that the telegraph, vibraplex telegraph key, the bug, and the mass-produced typewriter emerged at about the same time, allowing many of these press circuits to very rapidly reach the effective speeds of 60 to 80 words a minute. And if you've ever heard a press wire in use, it is an impressive thing to hear. For the uninitiated, though, it will sound a bit like hail on a tin roof. But but anyway, so this is the Phillips code, and hams still use a few of these. Like going, you'll hear an amateur say, yeah, dot dot it, or TT for that, and so forth. You will also, you run into some of these other little reflexive behaviors from different, telegraph methods in the ham radio service if you really know what to look for. Just a little introduction to Phillips code, right? So let's talk a little bit about the public interface and the culture of telegraphy. We usually, and you'll hear hams do this all the time, they call it railroad Morse. Okay, well, I want to stress again that, the American Morse code wasn't used just by the railroads. It was used by all commercial operations in North America. But small railroad offices in small towns typically had a Western Union agency, and they also had an operator for train dispatching and railroad message work and so forth. And this was probably the common model in small towns. A little bit bigger cities typically had, a dedicated telegraph office for, say, Western Union or Postal Telegraph Company, or Canadian National Telegraphs, or whatever, Canadian Pacific Telegraphs. And then, of course, you have the large relay offices with, literally hundreds of operators. So this is an example of an early telegraph office in Kansas, and you can kind of see the nature of it. Very simple and so forth. This was actually these photographs were provided by one of our members who started out as a telegraph operator, became an office manager for Western Union, and then eventually an executive. On the contrary, this is a large commercial relay office in Toronto, Ontario during the 1940s. So you can see the conveyor belt here, for incoming messages to go to the clerk. And basically each of these operators represented a subordinate telegraph circuit somewhere in Canada. And you can see, the typewriters, the resonators here with the sounders in them. You'd have this guy running over here. You'd have all those manual typewriters clicking away. It's probably maybe nobody here, if you haven't at some point in your life, and you most likely haven't, but it's a fascinating thing to walk through a relay office, because as you walk behind each operator, you can hear the traffic. It kind of changes. It's like walking down a street and overhearing different conversations as you walk by people. So, you hear one guy, you hear his message. As you keep moving past the next operator, his message fades away, and then you hear the traffic from the next guy. And it's really a fascinating thing that probably nobody will ever again in human history experience. But you can think of a relay office as, like a switch, right, or a router. But it just happens to be a manual router, and the telegraph networks are very much configured like an inverted pyramid, right? Very similar to the internet or the air traffic control system or something of that nature. And relay offices were all over the place, in both rail operations as well as commercial telegraphy. So again, very complex compared to the common, almost childlike perception people have of the telegraph industry. Again, we kind of touched on this. I'll breeze by this by this slide. Except to add the fact that, again, the telephone company was not only a big user, but broadcast networks. Because audio frequency broadcast loops are a very scarce commodity and expensive. The broadcast networks handled their coordination throughout the United States in Morse, reserving the audio carrier, you might say, for the actual broadcast content itself. So if you walked into, say, the NBC headquarters in New York City or in Chicago, you would see telegraph instruments everywhere, despite the fact that it was a radio broadcast, right? This is George Hack of the Western Union, a gentleman I referred to earlier. As a boy, he started out as a telegraph messenger, and then, of course, became an operator and eventually moved into management positions with the Western Union Company. And so this is a very early picture of him that is in the Morris Telegraph Club archives. And this is him as a young man in about 1920. As a manager at an office also, I believe, in either Oklahoma or Kansas. I don't recall which. This is a Canadian Pacific Railroad telegraph car in Vanceboro, Maine, right there by the Canadian border. And again, you can see this kind of portable arrangement over here. They move the car to where they're doing large construction projects or responding to, things like washouts and, coordinating wrecking things. And so when you see all the telegraph instruments, you can see the telegraph switchboard here and so on. A really important job in rail operations was the dispatcher. As mentioned earlier, train dispatchers would receive what were called OS reports from the wayside telegraph offices. And these were noted on a large spreadsheet, although they didn't call it that, they called it a train sheet, but a large spreadsheet indicating where the train was at any time on its territory between any of these two wayside offices. And this was called the telegraphic block system, and it basically allowed a dispatcher to control train movements over a division or a subdivision in rail operations. And so an OS report might be, dispatcher, DS, WY, you'd respond IDS, they say, engine 2935 by at 3:13 p.m. and he noted on the train sheet, so he would know the progress of that train, and then he could transmit a train order, typically a Form 19, but maybe something otherwise telling another train, for example, to take a siding until another train goes by, right? And so really the telegraph made safe and efficient dispatching and movement of trains across wide territories practical. This is another photograph, by the way, from the 1940s. These are called selectors. Won't dig into exactly how they work, but you'd push this button, and it was basically a telegraph. It works like the old pull boxes for fire alarms and in district telegraphy. You push the button, and it would ring a bell in the telegraph office to let the operator know he was wanted on the dispatcher circuit. And these were called selector keys. And then, of course, there were selectors in each wayside railroad office. You can see the sounder up here. There's also a telephone circuit in this picture. This is a press telegrapher in 1967 at the, I believe it was the Democrat National Convention. And you can see the lightning bug here, as well as a portable telegraph set. These are some press telegraphers in the New York City at the courthouse during the infamous Lonergan murder trial. One of those great sex-soaked, rather sex and alcohol and drug-soaked unpleasant situations involving a relatively wealthy heiress and a Canadian Forces airman who was ultimately convicted of murder and jailed. I think he was extradited back to Canada sometime in the 60s, but his name was Lonergan. And of course, all the telegraph operators there providing all the great gory details, because even in the 1940s, if it bleeds, it leads. So anyway, that gives you kind of an idea of how that worked. Here's another example of press telegraphers at work. You saw press telegraphers everywhere, any important event. Also, baseball games and the like, right? So it's important to understand again that throughout most of the early years of baseball, well into the 1950s, mid 1950s, and maybe even later for some of the smaller baseball clubs, the play-by-play announcers did not travel with the baseball club. Western Union would dispatch a telegraph operator to the baseball stadium, and he would go ahead and transmit the play-by-play in Morse. And then at the local broadcast station, another operator would transcribe the plays onto little slips of paper and hand them to the play-by-play announcer, for example, Red Barber in Cincinnati, or Ernie Harwell in Detroit, or whatever the case might be. So, for example, I can demonstrate, actually, I don't have, unfortunately can't do it in the hotel, but I could show you how I can actually send play-by-play faster in American Morse code with the key and sounder than you can speak it. So, for example, is strike one called. That's now batting for. Strike two fanned, and so forth. You can actually transmit a baseball game very efficiently in telegraphy using Phillips code. Again, very common to see telegraphers at any type of major sporting event. This picture makes the rounds a lot on the internet. I think you've probably maybe run into this somewhere. These are telegraphers at a World Series game at the Polo Grounds, and it was very common back in the day for newspapers and so forth to have large display boards where crowds would gather outside the newspaper office or in a large theater to watch the progress of an important World Series game with the basically the plays being simulated on either with a projector or on a large display board, and people by the hundreds of thousands would gather to get the information on the latest events on the baseball field via telegraph. This is the Chicago Board of Trade, I think in 1970 or so, and from a press photo. And again, he's transmitting to subordinate exchanges elsewhere in the United States. The twilight years of commodities and stock brokerage telegraphy. So let's talk a little bit about some let's call them myth busting. Some of you some years back may have read a book entitled The Victorian Internet. It was very popular. I think it was on the New York Times bestseller list. And like a lot of history written in our modern era, it's a very well-written book about the early days of telegraphy, but it also, as often happens with news and information, omissions become actually an important messenger. That is, I'm fond of saying that the lie of omission is far more important or dangerous than the lie of commission. And what you see in media, and I worked in media for 15 years, what you see in media is that there's a lot of manipulation based on omission. You can totally change perceptions by just, let's say accidentally, or even just through implicit bias or through lack of research, omitting important facts. And the Victorian Internet, despite its value as a book outlining the early days of telegraphy, gave the inappropriate and entirely wrong impression that the invention of the telephone displaced telegraphy, as if technologies are mutually exclusive. And I think most of us here are old enough to maybe know and experienced enough to know at face that new technologies often overlap older technologies or even rely on the infrastructure of older technologies as they evolve. And this was certainly true of the telephone. The telephone, it took most of the 20th century to fully displace, for the telephone to fully displace telegraphy, right? The main reason being was economies of scale. For at least until microwave carrier really becomes well established in the late 50s, early 60s, you could put a lot more telegraph circuits on telegraph signals on a circuit than you could voice circuits. So it was much cheaper to send telegrams. It was much cheaper to use services like telex. I think maybe most of the people here may be even old enough to remember telex, which was essentially a telegraphic method of communications using printers. And we mentioned concentrators and things of this nature. So in reality, the telephone really didn't displace the telegraph. The internet probably did more disruption to telegraphy and teleprinters than say the telephone. The teleprinter, of course, was developed in the practical teleprinter was developed in the early 20th century, and they became over time the dominant telegraphic tool, right? And if you take a look at a teletype, teleprinter as it's properly called, teletype's a brand name, they operate on the current loop concept as well. As a matter of fact, teletypes were designed specifically to replace traditional telegraph instruments. They operate at the same current values, say 20 milliamps or 60 milliamps, which is a typical current value in a manual telegraph loop. They were designed to operate in the same voltage range, say 100 to 150 volts DC. It's very similar in many respects. The first major application for teletypes or teleprinters was news distribution, not news origination, but for essentially news distribution by organizations like AP and United Press, and then eventually private wire service, right? Because you didn't have to employ expensive telegraph operators. Eventually, the teletype is adopted for commercial telegraphy, that is Western Union, primarily telegrams and the like. And of course, the switching centers are established. This allowed the companies to basically shed telegraphers who were reasonably well paid. And of course, in an era when you could pay young women a lot less than a man, you could hire young women to basically be attendants in an semi-automated or an automated switching center, and we began to see telegraphers disappear. The World War certainly accelerated this process, where more women came into the telegraph industry and greater automation arose as younger telegraphers were drafted or volunteered to go into the armed forces. And so we began to see with World War II, and particularly after the war, the demise of the Morse operator, right? Slowly at first, and then with greater rapidity. Early teleprinters only operated at 40 words a minute. Most later teleprinters operated, say, 60 or 66 words a minute. Those of you who were in, say, the media, worked for newspapers and broadcast news may remember that teleprinters as late as the mid-1980s were still in service all over the United States, operating at 66 words per minute. That is, 50 baud. And then, of course, commercial telegraphy was typically at about, 45 baud. And then later, there were other services, for example, FAA circuits and no weather wire or no Class A teleprinter circuits that operated 100 words a minute and so forth. But in reality, for much of the early days of the teleprinter, a telegraph operator could convey information, just as fast as a printer, and in some ways more efficiently. For example, if you're doing a box scores for a baseball game, or reporting on a horse race or something of this nature. But simple economics really begins to just, automation and so forth begins to slowly destroy the telegraph operator. But for good chunk of the early to mid 20th century, telegraphy held its own, mainly because, again, the combination of mass-produced telegraph typewriters in the mills and so forth, and the Vibroplex bug increased the speed on commercial telegraph circuits to a level that was, quite frankly, competitive with printers, and in some ways more flexible, right? You can take a small portable telegraph set with you to a ballpark or to a courthouse. It's a lot of effort to drag around a Model 15 teleprinter, because I've done it. I remember carrying one up for United Press up to the third floor offices of a broadcast station. And of course, I was young and physically fit, and lifting weights every other morning and running 6 miles, but dragging it up 3 flights of steps was not fun on a hot summer day. The telegraph offered kind of that portable flexibility through much of the first half of the 20th century. So what we see really beginning in the 30s, but really accelerating in the 40s and 50s, was automation, right? A combination of the teleprinter and then automatic switching centers. Western Union established a bunch of these around the country in the mid to late 30s. Then they began experimenting with microwave carrier about the same time AT&T and the telephone companies were, and the capacity and the speed of circuits begins to accelerate very rapidly, far exceeding anything manual telegraphy could do. And of course, along with that circuit capacity comes economies of scale and lower costs for users, and fewer employees, and all the benefits that offers. And most of these automatic switching centers worked by switching telegraphic traffic to an available circuit pair. Or carrier, circuit on a carrier system or the like. So essentially the switching occurred by taking entire message traffic, chunks of message traffic, and moving them to an idle circuit, okay? And then ultimately what happens is, at some point, in the post-war era, somebody says, well, instead of, switching to available circuits, let's break the message traffic into bite-sized packets, and we'll route that via whatever circuits are available, and thus the internet is born. So I'm going to shock everybody here by stating something very unorthodox. Al Gore did not invent the internet. I know it's going to shock all of you, but Al didn't invent the internet. In fact, you might argue that the internet is an evolution of the concentrator methods, the varioplex methods, etc., developed by the phone company and companies like Western Union. It was a natural evolution of this automatic switching process and so forth. No one person really invented the internet. Computing is what made the internet practical, but it was built on the foundation of these older theoretical concepts and so forth. So sorry, Al, hate to disappoint, but I'm going to call you on that. So a couple pictures of automatic switching center. You can see young women working there and so forth. Again, very common. So let's talk a little bit as we wrap up the program, the myth-busting portion of the program. Number one is, of course, as was kind of implied in the Victorian internet, the telephone made the telegraph obsolete. Absolutely untrue. And we discussed this, issues of reliability, the improved or better long distance capabilities, the availability of multiplexing, as well as the speed and accuracy for record message traffic, and the extensive established infrastructure meant that telegraphy competed quite nicely with the phone company up until the development of microwave carrier in the 1950s. The telegraph disappeared in the 1890s or 1920s or 1950s. No, it really didn't. I chuckled a little bit years ago when ham radio was rife with arguments about the CW testing requirements, and it sort of was it was the ham radio equivalent of those third rail subjects that we run into in our political landscape, sort of the abortion issue or gun control, right? Hams were calling each other names, the ad hominems were flying, the ignorant, trolling on pages like QRZ. If you weren't a ham back in the early 2000s when the CW testing debate was going full bore, just imagine your typical Facebook responses to a political post today, and you'll kind of understand the tone of the dialogue. And you would hear people say, well, why should I have to learn something that, hasn't been used for 100 years, and things of this nature. Well, the telegraphy was used a long time. Again, there were still some legacy telegraph circuits and services in place into the early 1980s. Admittedly, usage had greatly diminished, but it was a pretty common technology well into the 1950s. Another myth is that Morse is slow and inefficient. And if you believe this, then I would challenge you to compare an NTS upper echelon CW traffic net, like TCC, or as RRI calls it, IATN. You compare that to, say, an equivalent voice net. Back in 2016, during a federal disaster exercise in the Pacific Northwest, the CW circuits scored an accuracy rate of 99.998% against over 13,000 data points and 5-letter cipher group messages between the Pacific Northwest and the Federal National Response Coordination Center in Washington, D.C., outperforming a high-frequency modified hybrid mesh network utilizing Pactor by about maybe an average throughput time for the telegraph circuits. The radio telegraph circuits was measured in basically 10 to 13 minutes, and it was more in the range of a half hour or longer for the data circuits. So is more slow and efficient? Well, that exercise pretty well put that issue to bed. So let's talk a little bit again, just to finish up. Here's our Western Electric sounders from the Watson Company sounder from the 70s. We have our electromagnets, our brass armature, our metal piece here. Again, I think Western Electric was still manufacturing sounders into the 1960s, believe it or not. You occasionally see this type of device. This is called a resonator. And again, the resonator is essentially adds kind of some softness and amplification to the rhythm patterns of the telegraph sounder. They come in various forms. We, of course, have the standard key, or as hams call it, a straight key, but telegraphers never called it a straight key. They called it a standard key here with the circuit closer, and then, of course, bugs or the vibroplex key and so forth. These are relays over here, and, of course, this is a box relay, and a box relay is essentially both a relay and a portable telegraph instrument for use in the field. But they work on similar principles. Here's some various portable telegraph instruments from, the, say, 1930s, 40s. This is probably late 19th century, and this is an AT&T portable set from the 1960s. Telegraphic switchboard. You can see here, here's the telegraph loop coming into the office, and you could either put two of these little pins here right across from each other, and that would go ahead and basically bypass the office. Or if you put them kind of diagonally like this, you would connect that circuit through, or that loop, through a set of telegraph instruments in the telegraph office. So if you look over here, you had basically 1, 2, 3, 4 instruments, or 4 operating positions in the office. And you had, of course, 4 telegraph loops coming into the office. So this would typically be a kind of typical arrangement, you might say, for a decent little railroad wayside office or the like. Here's some miscellaneous telegraph items. The early crowsfoot batteries used for either local power for the local sounder, or in large quantities in the very early days of telegraphy for the battery needed to operate the loop. This device is in my collection. This is a secret sounder. This came from President Roosevelt's telegrapher, E. Stewart Davis. He shadowed Franklin Roosevelt around, and this came out of the Washington, D.C. Western Union office. And essentially, it's a telegraph relay, of course, a standard key. In here are 2 dry cell batteries and kind of a little RC circuit. And this is a standard, 75 ohm headset. And this would reproduce the telegraphic sounds in the headset. And you can see these in use in pictures at old presidential press conferences in the 30s and 40s and the like. A pocket lineman's relay here, a pocket relay it's often called. And this is a selector or a messenger call box. You would turn the little crank, much like a fire alarm or the like, and it would send a coded impulse to the Western Union office, and they would have your ID. It would tell you what office needed a telegraph messenger, and you would dispatch a boy on a bicycle or whatever to go pick up the outgoing telegrams and bring them to the telegraph office. This is a nice little Western Electric KOB, these are called, key on board. And this is another little item here in my collection, which is a telegrapher's badge from the 1948 Republican National Convention. You see here's this telegraph operator. In that particular year, old Mr. Dewey there was nominated at Philadelphia, although he didn't defeat Truman, so what can I say? Here's some polar relays. This one here came from AT&T, and it was used to, it's actually a British post office relay that they ran tests on and analyzed, still has the tag. This is the constitution of the Order of Railroad Telegraphers and so forth. So I'm going to close the PowerPoint presentation with a few thoughts. First and foremost, one of the lessons that you might learn from the telegraph era is that some standardization is good. The Western Union monopoly, despite its faults, proved efficient by standardizing connectivity. Much like Microsoft, for all its faults, standardized business software products, right? Before the Western Union monopoly was created, or oligopoly, or whatever you want to call it, the Western Union system standardized methods, and they also created a universal telegraph service, much like the Bell system at the Bell companies, right? The Bell operating companies and AT&T. Before Western Union, you might have 3 or 4 telegraph offices or more in town. You'd have to know which one had communications with which city so you could send a telegram, whereas Western Union made it possible to walk into any telegraph office and send a telegram to any city, right? And of course, Western Union, as it congealed out of multiple telegraph companies, served as a model for the Bell system, as well as many electrical and gas utilities. So some standardization is certainly good when it comes to the telegraph industry. Another lesson that you can take from the telegraph era is that new technology always leads to excessive speculation and fraud. There's something in the human psyche that everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, many people have a dream of getting rich quick. And this makes them vulnerable to exaggerated promises for new technologies. And we saw this in the early days of telegraphy. The undercapitalized companies, the stock manipulation, the early overvaluation of stock and investment promises. And we saw this repeated in the early days of wireless telegraphy and radio, right? With the DeForest scandals and, Abraham White, the stock manipulators getting involved and so forth. And then, of course, we saw it repeated again when the internet was all the rage in the 90s and everybody was investing in internet startups and a lot of people lost their shirts. So I don't know what the next big thing will be. I don't have a crystal ball, but suffice to say, caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware. When you're investing in new technologies and in new promises. Maybe AI will be the next big scam, who knows? But anyway, the other lesson I think to take home from the telegraph era, in my opinion anyway, is that telecommunications technology is really only of value as a force multiplier. So it was common, again, probably the late 80s, early 90s, to go to, for example, a policy conference with a lot of government officials and, so-called thought leaders, the pseudo-intelligentsia that wanders the halls of our Ivy League universities and the like. And you would hear a common refrain that the new information economy was going to replace the old manufacturing economy. And we would all live happily ever after, sitting in internet cafes, texting celebrity gossip to each other, and that only intellectual property would have value. And this new information economy was going to replace the old manufacturing economy. I once got laughed at a conference for arguing against this concept. As a matter of fact, nobody would sit with me at the luncheon. I sat by myself at like a 10-top table. I would like to meet some of those people now and ask them how this new information economy is working for them. Where the loss of manufacturing, the massive transfer of capital investment and technology to Asia has hindered our ability to efficiently distribute wealth across the various classes in our country. It's pulled the stepping stones or the rungs of the upward mobility ladder out for many people, and it's destroyed. The loss of manufacturing has destroyed our capacity to create wealth. And as a result, you can have all the telecommunications technology that you want, but it's not of much value unless it's a force multiplier or a tool for supporting other industrial or commercial endeavors, right? So telecommunications has great value. It is a force multiplier. It allows companies to operate more efficiently. It lowers costs. It allows for better data analytics and many very useful things. But those things are just a component in ultimately doing something that creates wealth. And quite frankly, the basic rule of the last several hundred years still stands, which is there's only three ways to create wealth, which is mining, agriculture, or manufacturing. Otherwise, you're basically transferring wealth in exchange for service. So some final thoughts. Telegraphy is unique in that it is both a technology and an art form. And that's perhaps one of the things that provides its lasting appeal to a large body of ham radio operators, right? It is an art form. Telegraphy is to fly fishing as digital communications is to bait fishing, or a bobber and a cane pole. The digital communications can be very efficient on the ham bands, but ultimately, once you build the digital communications system, you assemble the devices and you play with it for a while. For me, anyway, it seems like about as exciting as watching a microwave oven operate. But telegraphy is always a challenge, right? To develop the art form, to be a better operator, to try different things with it, contesting and traffic handling and conversational Morse and maybe mobile CW. There's always a challenge that goes with it. Telegraphy is a unique period in human history. The telegraph operator was a conduit in the flow of information. He was the first to learn all the important news, the beginning of a war, the end of a war, the important births and deaths in his community. The telegrapher and telegraphy was really unique in historical context. Finally, last but not least, little is new in history. We just forget the past. Americans, or human beings, I should say, human beings are generationally myopic. We believe that somehow we're different than our forefathers because we fool ourselves into believing we're different than our forefathers because we assume we're living at the pinnacle of human progress. And we often measure that progress based on our technological capabilities. For example, we will assume that we are an advancing civilization because we have cellular telephones and chat GPT and so forth. But if you look at things from a historical context, throughout history, the progress of civilization was not measured just by technology. It was measured by human rights, social justice. It was measured by progress in the fine arts, in literature, in music, and so forth. And by these classical measures, for example, I would argue that we're actually de-evolving as a civilization. We no longer create great literature. We no longer create great music. The performing arts have kind of been turned into kind of a juvenile, prurient activity, almost softcore pornography. Entire art forms have disappeared from the human experience. Poetry and classical music, and again, things like great literature that provides insight, depth, and meaning to the human experience. But yet we think we're progressing because our telecommunications tools are better. Well, I would challenge you to remember that history has a broad arc, and we shouldn't measure ourselves solely by telecommunications. So that is my conclusion here with the presentation, and I will try something here. I'm going to stop the share for a minute, and let's go ahead, and I'll take a few questions. I'm going to try and play a YouTube video showing me doing some telegraph activities so that you can kind of see and hear sounders in operation and things of that nature. But we'll take a little break, and you guys can ask questions or throw rotten tomatoes at me or do whatever, because I can't really get hit. So comments, questions, etc. Anything I can clarify.
I don't think anybody's going to be throwing anything like food at you that's too expensive.
That's true. Any comments? Okay. Well, let's see what's in the chat. Hello from Texas. Commercial common carriers that handled CW for commercial vessels had similar facilities that you were showing. Got the same vibe walking past each operator. Yes, Steve, absolutely. Here's an interesting tidbit. Speaking of, like, for example, the maritime services, it wasn't that unusual many years ago to see an operator receiving a radiogram on a maritime frequency and simultaneously sending it to the Western Union operator a few words behind in American Morse code on the telegraph circuit. We had one guy in our Telegraph club. He was challenged with a bet. He claimed that he could copy a message in French and a message in English simultaneously, transcribing the telegrams with both his left and right hand simultaneously. So this bet was challenged with one operator sending him a message in English and another operator sending him a thing. And of course, he was able to prove that he could do it. So these guys that did this stuff, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, they were pretty amazing, really. It was, some of them almost appeared superhuman. Let's put it like that.
Hey, Dennis, you've got your hand up there, sir.
Yeah, a couple of comments. Yeah, what wonderful presentation. This was beautiful. I mean, just a great history and a great sweep of the history of telegraphy. I just love this. I'm curious if you know Ken Miller.
I do. Yeah.
K6CTW. Yeah, he's a good friend of mine, and we work together. And he's told me about being able to copy Continental code and mentally gyrate it into sending the Continental code. What did I say? The American Morse code. Listening to American Morse and translating it into Continental code simultaneously, and that just blows my mind. But you just described that, and yeah, he's talked about that. And we've had him here on RATPAC a few years ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's a great guy. And unfortunately, I was one of his victims for a thing he did with National Geographic, like the thing he did on Jay Leno was a bit. But I was his victim for another one of those escapades.
Yeah, I used to I'd be on a radio CW radio telegraph net and also be communicating at the same time, on a Morse wire, and we can do the two simultaneously. Now, of course, that sounds really impressive, but you have to understand that a truly proficient telegraph operator treats telegraphy as a language, right? It's
Sure.
For example, I was operating CW Mobile a couple of years ago, and I got called by a Polish station. And, I was kind of driving down the road, and first we conversed in English, and then, I said a few things to him in Polish, and before you know it, I'm right doing CW Mobile, driving down the road, saying, okay, I need to stick with the Polish, but it's a little bit like being bilingual, right?
Right, that's right.
If you're, for example, a lot of people in Puerto Rico, they speak, both Spanish and English very well, and they just go back and forth between them, and they don't think anything of it,
Me
right?
too. Yeah,
And
that's wonderful. Yeah, working CW mobile is quite a challenge. I've done that back in college days when I was much younger and much better at it than I am.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
That was a lot of fun and quite good. Interesting about being, you're talking about the press circuits and things like UPI and API. I worked for, you may know the company, Logicon Intercom, and we were one of the early companies to go to cold type,
Hmm.
going from hot metal to cold
Right.
type.
Yeah, sure. Hmm.
So we had a couple of interesting products. One was to get rid of the teletype machine, the teleprinters.
Right.
As you're right, teleprinters. We had a little box that basically would sit on a current loop and it was directly connected into a PDP 1170 computer or a cluster of 1170s that would receive the press wire and do all the filtering, by the subscriptions. It had to do all of that work too, because each, depending on what service you're subscribing to, you had to decode that service. And I think commonly referred to as a stunt box, but it was an electronic stunt box. That was fascinating working for that industry and being part of that back in the late 70s, early 80s. Amazing stuff.
Yeah, the step beyond the TLA, the terminal line adapter, right? Yeah, I certainly remember stunt boxes for sure.
Oh yeah. I have one of the things I'm in the process of restoring here is a Twix machine.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
It's a Model 19 teletype, and I actually had it operating years ago, and it has fallen into disrepair, unfortunately, over the years, but I want to restore it and get it back on the air. But it came out of service when I bought it. It had just come out of service, and that was in around 1974, 1975. So that technology was still being used then, that's for sure, the Twix system.
Yeah.
That's we're running kind of late here, so
Yeah.
let's get some more questions here from the crowd out here. Anybody else got any questions? Raise your hand, put it in chat, whatever.
Thank you again, James. That was wonderful. Just a delightful presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to post a couple of things here before we conclude, 'cause I know we are running over time on the chat. I have a YouTube video where I send some information in both. It's all in tone because most hams they can't copy on a sounder. But if you want to hear what American Morse code sounds like versus international, this YouTube video here that I just posted may be helpful. So the first is some quotes from the memoirs of Herbert Hoover. There's a very humorous one in there. If you can copy CW, you'll get a laugh about it. It's about ham radio operators in President Hoover's memoirs. But the second portion of it is the same content, but in American Morse code, but with tone. So you can kind of hear the differences between the codes. That might be helpful for some of you. If you haven't encountered this video before. And then I'll send this video, put that in the chat window as well. It's every Christmas we set up a working telegraph circuit between Saginaw, Michigan and North Pole, Alaska. And we send Christmas telegrams. And you can see that process works with the clerks collecting the telegrams, passing them to me, signing a serial number and sending them on the Morse wire. So those are a couple of things that if somebody's interested, you can kind of dig in and look at those. And again, it is, we are running late. It's, 10:30 Eastern time. So I guess, Dan, I'll turn it back to you and you can kind of mine for any final questions or comments and we can let you adjourn for the night. But hey, guys, I appreciate your time and the fact that we have some people here. So.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate this. But I'll be sure to send me your slides if you wouldn't mind. I like to have a PDF, but I'll take whatever you got so we can capture some of that information you showed us. And I don't see any questions out there. Real quick, raise your hands or something in chat.
Yeah, by the way, Dan, I kind of forgot to mention there are, if you want to go to the Morse Telegraph Club webpage, use the .com, not the .org. And the reason I say that is our .org page was stolen by a gambling syndicate in Malta some years back, and they tried to extort us out of about 10 grand or so, and we gave them the proverbial middle finger, or as they say in Ireland, we said Pug Mahon. I don't know if anybody knows what that means. Anyway, so we got MorseTelegraphClub.com. So there are actually two Morse Telegraph Club web pages. The .com is actually the up-to-date one, and I just posted that also here on the chat. So.
I see that. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for your sharing your knowledge and experience there. I'm sure a lot of the old timers could relate to various parts of that. I know I got a bug here, and I used to at one time in my younger years, I worked for Teletype for a while. So we all have our memories, have been around for a while. We directly or indirectly had experiences of what you're sharing with us tonight. Okay, one last call, and I pull the plug here, folks. Anybody got any questions, answers, feedback? Okay, well, wait, James, I don't know why I keep calling you wait, but James, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. We look forward to having you come back again.
Sounds good, Dan. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish everybody a good evening. 73 to all.